Good afternoon.
Hello, everybody.
How
Welcome.
yeah, welcome. How are you today, friend?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to talk about existential OCD and the recovery from existential OCD with my best bud.
Yeah, let's talk about some exposures, shall we?
Let's do it. Where
Okay.
shall we begin?
Whew. Um, well, we've talked about an array of different variants of this obsession and compulsions. So, I guess it depends on where we want to start
Yes, that's
with which variation.
exactly because there are so many different ways that this particular theme can manifest. It's almost like it needs several different subtypes below it.
I know they kind of all do. Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. They do. It does. But just to remind everybody, when we're talking about exposure and response prevention and we're talking about exposures, I want to emphasize, and I'm sure Lauren does, that when we're doing active exposures, it's just as important that we're not compulsing while doing that exposure, because otherwise you've undermined the hard work, and
Yep, absolutely. In
that's not
fact,
fun.
no, no good. That's
No.
no good.
Right.
I think if you have to choose one, response prevention is always the choice
Right.
because there are, as we've talked about many times on here, exposures everywhere. And so,
Yep. So if we can, in response prevention, meaning not doing actual compulsions versus adding in the exposures. And oftentimes, especially like near end of treatment, the exposure is just exposure mindset, right? It's more of like, we're not going to compulse. We're going to just lean into things that make us uncomfortable.
mhm,
And sometimes people get in this trap of, I'm not going to get better unless I do my exposures.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a whole nother, you know, rabbit hole.
whole,
So,
yeah,
uh,
absolutely. It's so true though that this concern about, oh my gosh, I'm not going to get better because I'm not doing exposure work or I'm not doing the right exposure work
yeah.
comes up a lot for people. Um, but so let's take a concrete example though,
Mhm.
like any old example, and talk about what the exposure part is and what the response prevention part is, and maybe about how doing response prevention could happen even in the absence of the exposure.
Yeah. So we could talk about, like, is this real? Am I real? Is the world around me real?
Yep.
Um,
So if that's your main source of anxiety, is
yeah.
this potential that you're not living in reality or that what you see is not reality, then there are likely to be a lot of things that would trigger that concern. What are some examples of that?
This could be a variety of movies
Oh,
where
yeah,
that promotes that. Matrix, we've talked about in the past.
yeah.
Truman
Truman Show.
Show.
Yeah.
Um, Shutter Island, that's has that I'm not mentally well flavor to it though, too.
Mhm.
It's like
Oh,
this
yeah.
isn't, or I could be a ghost.
Ooh. Yeah, Sixth Sense.
Sixth Sense.
Sorry, spoilers, but what are you gonna do?
Yeah, I
Um,
know.
if you haven't seen it, it's been a long time since the '90s, so, um, so anyway, um, yes, you're right,
You've had plenty of time to catch up.
there's been a lot of time. I think it was a '90s thing anyway.
Hmm,
No, there's lots
a
of
long time ago.
movies that can be, triggering, as we've said before as well, that, states of depersonalization, derealization,
Mhm.
can also be very triggering. Um, so those are a couple of triggers that you might come across. So let's just say that somebody's watching the Truman Show and they have this subtype, they have this fear related to what if this isn't reality? What if what I see is
This is like
not?
a stage.
Yep.
Mhm.
And then they watch this movie and they're like, "Oh my gosh, that's my worst fear," right? Well, we've done now an exposure by watching this film.
Mhm.
Even watching a scene within the film is
Yes, for sure.
theoretically an exposure. And so what is the response prevention part of it?
So the response prevention piece in all of this would be making sure that you're tracking your mental rumination that's going on. Because, oh, buddy, if
Mm.
you're telling yourself things,
Buddy.
oh, buddy, hang on. If
Yeah.
you're going, let's say in session, we're sitting with a client, we're watching a clip. Let's say it's a 1 minute, 2-minute clip. And you just see like that blank look in their face. Snap out of it.
Snap out of it.
It's like you want to be reflective in that you're saying, am I giving myself reassurance?
Mhm.
Am I telling myself, oh, you're fine. This is just a movie. I have lots of evidence that proves that this wouldn't be the case. I'm not Jim Carrey, although everyone probably wishes they were as
At
funny as
least I
him.
think I'm not
But
Jim Carrey.
might be.
Maybe we're yeah, being John Malkovich is another great movie. Speaking
Yes.
of, that's a trigger, but I digress.
Yeah.
Yeah, so watching the mental rumination,
And
right?
really staying grounded and present in your feeling that's going
Mhm.
on in your body, noticing even your mind trying to pull into giving you reassurance
Yep.
or looking for evidence or tracking the past or bringing up memories, anything like that.
Yep. So, and I think that this brings up a good point, which is that response prevention isn't all or none. Sometimes we're going to catch ourselves in the response. I think that's
Yeah,
particularly true with mental compulsions, and that's okay.
totally
And
okay. And part of it, everyone's going to do it.
yep, absolutely. It's when you recognize, oh wow, I'm ruminating. What do you do then? That's the
Yep.
question. That's where response prevention can come into play. Um, and in that too, I think checking your emotional temperature is a big one. Like, oh well, does this feel real? As
Yeah.
we talked about before. Any other compulsions that you think, like, I can see reassurance seeking, for instance, coming up here? So that would mean that the response prevention would be refraining from asking for reassurance. So if you want to ask whoever you're watching the movie with, like, hey, we don't live in the Truman Show, right?
That's never happened to you before, right? That's or there's really true to
You-
be like, the other day I was driving and I noticed that my radio does this every time I go by there. Isn't that strange? Like, there's a lot of ways you can get super sneaky with your reassurance seeking.
Yep.
So
Yep.
beware.
Absolutely. That's such a important point. So yeah. Oh, have you ever had the thought that you might be in like an alternate reality? Or that you might not be real or whatever.
Yeah.
I think you could find yourself doing physical compulsions with this subtype, as with any, you might be
Yeah, like
like tapping.
grabbing, pinching yourself,
Yeah,
touching things and make sure they're real.
exactly.
I think the one where you're saying, like, "Does this feel real?" is a big one.
Yes,
Do I
absolutely.
feel like I'm in my body? And to clarify, there's no way of feeling that. So we're testing anxiety, I think, really more than anything, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There is no way to feel like feel real doesn't
Real.
even mean
It's
anything.
not a feeling. Yeah, it's just
It's like I don't feel like myself. Well, what does yourself feel like? That's my question for that one, is like that yourself feels a million different things, including whatever you're feeling right now,
right.
because you are yourself and you're feeling it. So,
Yeah.
um, and of course, there can be avoidance, and this is sort of review of last episode, but you can find yourself not watching these movies, or trying not to, maybe canceling on a friend because they want to see something that you think is going to be triggering. And the idea with all of these things, like we said, like, don't ask for the reassurance, don't go back in your mind and try to figure out any of the things you might be inclined to figure out. um, Stop yourself when you're reaching toward that thing to touch it, to see if you
Mhm.
can physically feel it, and lean in, right? I think avoidance is the most important thing to do active exposure work around, for the obvious reasons, right? Like, if you're not going out and living your life because you're avoiding things, then we do have to do some active exposure work in that situation.
Yeah.
But
And going into values too is like, it's important that I am, very engaged with my friendship, and that might mean that I'm going to get triggered because we're going to go watch a movie together, and spending time is a really important value of mine.
Yep. Yeah. So true. So
Yeah.
hopefully that kind of outlines though what we mean when we say exposure and response prevention, and specifically with this subtype is, and why the response prevention piece unto itself is so important, because you can imagine that you're, going throughout your day and somebody is like, you ever see that movie, The Truman Show? And all of a sudden you're, oh, ding, 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 ding.
Yeah.
Ah! And yeah, and that you can find yourself wanting to check to see if you feel real, wanting to reach out to touch that thing to see if you can feel it there,
Mhm.
or ask for reassurance. And what we want to do is to say, I'm not going to figure that out. I don't know whether or not I'm living in the Truman Show. I've made a decision about how I'm going to handle that thought,
Right.
because it doesn't ultimately matter whether or not I'm living in the Truman Show. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Probably not, but
Yeah, but might as well live my best Truman Show life
I'm going to live my
and
best Truman Show life. Yes.
be a top selling show,
Hey, make it interesting for people, right?
Don't be too dangerous, but yeah, make it
No,
interesting.
no. Yeah. And I know we say this in our intro and outro, but like, it's really important to acknowledge here too, that if you're in therapy, or even if you're not in therapy, but you're reading things, or you're getting support from somebody. I guess mostly it's in therapy. Wow. But I digress.
Wait, what are we saying?
The point, Walter,
Yeah.
essentially that when you are in therapy and you're working on exposure and response prevention, it's important that you follow what you and your therapist are coming up with conjointly. Like, this isn't therapy. We're here to talk about how this whole business works so that you can support yourself in navigating the system. But, we're not saying go out and watch The Truman Show if this happens to be you, right? Like, that's something that takes a lot of nuance to determine, like, is this the best time for me to start doing that degree of exposure work? And am I going to do the response prevention? Because as Kelley said before, if you do the exposure and you don't do the response prevention, you're basically just torturing yourself.
Yeah. It's undue distress.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said. I think especially with this subtype of OCD, there's definitely a level of checking online for people who have same or similar diagnoses and making sure this is OCD or not. So I think in particular to be wary of looking to us or anyone else who isn't your therapist and running with an idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Check in with the people that are on your team who know you.
Yeah, who've mapped out the OCD very well. So.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So in terms of other exposures, right? Like we've kind of talked about, it's whatever's going to trigger you on purpose. That's the exposure part.
So if we're looking at things like dissociation, which is a really common trigger for people with this, it could be almost inducing it in a way, like being in the shower, driving your car, like anything that already generates a level of dissociation, because humans dissociate all day long on certain levels and they fluctuate. And the thing is if you have a panic attack, it's likely that person dissociates a little bit too. But anything that I think, and tell me if you have anything to add, but like a trance-like state where your brain can go on autopilot. So stuff that doesn't require like really intense concrete thinking. It's just automatic, like driving.
Yes. And I will say, just for whatever it's worth, because I know that this is not what you meant, but I can imagine watching it like, oh, well, translate state. Maybe I should take like a a drug, right?
No.
Like, we're not advocating for that. And again,
No.
not direct advice anyway, but it's more something habitual in day-to-day life where you're going to be a little checked out. Um, but
Like, you
not
don't have to concretely think about how to fold your clothes.
right. Or
Yeah.
drive a car. And one of the things actually that tends to induce that sense of derealization is writing the same thing over and over and over again.
Ooh, that's a good one.
And what's cool is that you can kind of meld exposures here. You could say, like,
Totally.
I may not be real. I may not be real over and over and over again. So you're going to both like be doing exposure to this idea, but also the writing of it itself is going to potentially create the state that is of unreality that's triggering.
Ooh, that's such a good one. That would be a good one for, like, the mental health obsessions too, like, "I'm going
Mm,
crazy, I'm losing my mind, losing
yeah.
my mind." Dang.
Dang.
Dang, check you out, girl. Wow.
Well, it's all a bit sadistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think you're absolutely spot on in citing that. We call those interoceptive exposures when
Mhm.
we're trying to elicit that sort of felt experience, which you see a lot with panic disorder. It's like, oh, I'm gonna run so that I get my heart rate up and my breath is short,
Or
which
drink a bunch of coffee.
yeah, yeah. Let's see what
Ooh,
happens. Whew.
sounds like I think the protocols like breathing through a straw, right? It's
Hmm.
been a while since I've done a panic exposure, but
Yeah, or spinning around in a chair.
yeah, I mean, if someone did that to me, I'd probably vomit, but
Ooh, which could be a great emetophobia
yeah.
exposure. Um, yeah, no, I think, and again, it's important to remember that once you do this, like once if you're writing the phrase "I might not be real" over and over again, you might notice that there are these invitations to figure out whether or not you're real.
Absolutely, and that goes back to the Truman Show exposure
Mhm.
or even, like, recording that on loop in your headphones and listening to it, like, there's lots of opportunity to go, "Oh, am I?" But to remember, like, our job, primary directive is to come back.
Yes, is I'm not
Notice
figuring that out right now.
Yeah,
Not doing that. Who knows? Maybe. Done.
right, and with the realistic expectation that just by doing that exposure does not mean your anxiety is gonna go away or that feeling of the not feeling real aspect, that's not what we're going for here, unfortunately.
Mm.
Um, it's not gonna magically go away.
It's not. And the whole, as we've talked about so many times, the whole point of treatment is to get better at feeling those feelings. So we're bringing them up on purpose so that you can learn to sort of settle in for the ride.
Yeah, to learn how to feel it, to
Yeah.
feel it without it treating it like it's dangerous.
Yeah. A lot of people will say, well, I have no choice but to feel it. How do
Oh,
you like
that's so true.
yeah.
I feel anxious all the time, why would I It's
Right.
like,
Like,
"Well,
why would I make myself more anxious? And it's like, well, actually, are you feeling it though when it comes up? Or are you trying to
to
get
get
rid of
rid of
it
it."
the
And then
whole
it
time?
lasts way longer than it needs to.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because you do have a choice. You could fight it. You can fight it.
And yeah.
I've tried.
Oh, good lord, me
Yeah,
too.
yeah. Not effective, unfortunately, as we've said so many times. But
Right, but what happens is that your brain kind of, moves on if you just
yeah,
let it.
yeah.
It's
And then
gonna
it might
do it
come
on its
back at
own. Yeah,
yeah,
it has its own agenda.
yeah.
But I say that because if we're doing a tape on loop or we're writing out that exposure, like this, I may not be real over and over. And as like we're on to like minute 2 of it, and that person's feeling more anxiety or the same amount of anxiety, their brain's like, well, this isn't working. It's like,
Mm,
well, that's not the point of the exercise. The
yeah,
exercise is just to feel it. And then we're going to move on with our day with something else of value.
yeah, absolutely. One thing that occurred to me as you were talking a minute ago is that it's and in terms of this whole resisting an emotional experience, uh, one analogy that we might use is it's like being on a train, right? You are on a train. You are not driving the train.
No, you are not.
You are a passenger.
We're on the Polar Express,
Oh
folks.
my gosh, I just read that to my daughter for the first time today. Oh,
Oh,
love that book.
yeah. Tell me when you'd read The Velveteen Rabbit, because
Oh, I have that one makes me cry. Yeah. Ah. So anyway, we're on the Polar Express, as it were, of our minds, and it takes us through all sorts of emotional terrain, and it brings up all sorts of thoughts. We don't get to choose that. You could sit and go, I really wish I was driving this train, right? And like just sort of get really upset about it and fight it and like grit your teeth and like knock really hard on the
Yeah.
conductor's door and be like, I deserve to drive this train, right? But none of those things are going to make it so that you're driving it.
Yeah, it's true. We're talking about like suffering at this point when we do that.
Exactly. But you can decide what your train ride within the context of that particular train is
Of being
going
a
to,
passenger.
yeah,
Yeah.
what it's going to be like. Like, are you going to spend time chatting with your neighbor on the train, who's also in their pajamas because we're on the Polar Express?
Mm.
Or are you going to, like, lay back and kick up your feet and feel the cushions beneath your behind? Or
Yeah.
are you going to read a book, or right, like all of these different things that you can do while you are on this ride? But it doesn't make sense to fight upstream to resist what is actually happening.
Yeah, it's a great analogy. It's a
Thanks.
great analogy. I mean, I find myself doing that on planes.
Yeah.
Like, I wanna be in control, and I wanna know what's going on, and tensing up every time there's a movement, and then realizing the tensing isn't preventing the plane from crashing or having turbulence.
No, it is not.
So I have found like breathing, progressive muscle relaxation is what I need to do to try to foster my best plane ride experience ever, which is already very low.
We're
So,
talking
like,
about a low bar.
low bar is like, let's survive, let's redirect our mind, let's try to engage with our friend on the plane or being alone and listening to music, whatever it is. But like, just like the physical tension too that goes on in doing exposures, like
Mm.
reading a story that triggers this obsession, or writing this down, or watching a movie, is like, notice true, like, are you super tense? Because that's sending messages to your brain that like, this is scary and dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, it's important to note that some of that is within your control, right? Like you can do progressive muscle relaxation, but sometimes it's just like, can we make space for the tension?
Yeah,
Right?
that too.
Can we soften in the face of the physical tension? Because sometimes people are like, oh, well, no, but I'm tense, so I now have to get rid of the tension. It's like, no,
Well,
no.
true.
No, you don't have to get rid of the tension. You just have to be willing to sort of
Yeah,
be with whatever's coming up.
yeah.
But don't further the tension.
Yes,
And
exactly.
yeah,
You
no,
can observe it.
exactly. Any other thoughts?
Um, I'm trying to think about the other existential variants we spoke about.
Sure. Like the stuff around death and dying.
Yeah, death and dying is one that we should probably give some airtime to.
Yeah.
Um, will you remind me the compulsions we went over? Do you remember?
I mean, I think that they were much the same as the ones we were just talking about. We talked some about reassurance seeking and how, especially with kiddos, that's something that comes up a lot. And so reassurance seeking, also sort of mentally trying to figure out how you're going to deal with things in the future. That's so rumination is definitely part of it.
Right, like almost planning out, how am I going to respond when all these people die, and um mapping out even like what that's like what it looks like and what the funeral will be like, and
how will I be able to feel the feelings that I believe I'm going to feel, and all of that.
yeah,
Sort of projecting into the future, testing yourself, like you're going to somehow prepare yourself for this inevitability.
right,
um, and even you could take that into your own death as well, if that's your primary fear, that okay, well, what will it be like in that last moment, trying to figure it out, trying to resolve it.
yeah,
um, and again, the response prevention is dropping those behaviors, whether reassurance seeking, um, like about whether or not somebody's sick or going to die soon, or it's ruminating about whether, like, how you would deal with it, or even you could find yourself ruminating about somebody else's health, right? Like, oh, well, are they showing symptoms of
yes.
XYZ?
And also like optimizing the amount of time you spend with them,
Mhm.
right? Which
Which
feeds
is
in.
tricky.
It is tricky, and it also feeds into like, am I living my best? It could be. It could also look like that, an obsession
Yeah.
on that. Like, am I living my best version of my life?
Yeah.
And I could see this being super tricky where it's, I really care about this person. It's my value to spend quality time with this person. And then you go, well, then where's the exposure?
Yeah, and I think that and you could get caught up in, like, well, am I supposed to spend time with them or not? And that's where
Right.
I think the emphasis on exposure is so problematic, because
Agreed.
it's not about whether or not you spend time with that person. It's about what you do while you're spending time with
Correct.
that person, and whether or not you're in your mind trying to grasp every moment, which is such a nebulous concept, right? Like, how does one grasp with one's mind? But if you've been there, I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Or if you feel like, okay, it's so like I must see them right now because I just had a really scary thought of them dying,
Yeah.
then we can wait a minute,
Yeah.
like that's
Yes.
that's that
Yeah.
one's pretty obvious, but it's
Yeah.
not always that obvious, and there is a lot of nuance. And like what Lauren's saying is that as long as we're not sitting there just mourning this inevitable loss because we're all dying, well, then we're just gonna have to be with it.
Yeah. Can I be with the feeling without perpetuating the story,
Yes.
the narrative in my mind,
Yeah.
chewing on it, so to speak? Uh,
The
yeah.
mental chew.
The mental chew. Taste the rainbow.
That's so intense.
Oh my God. It is so intense. Stop chewing. Yeah.
I mean, even this weekend, I'm not gonna lie, I was spinning a little bit. I was like, "I don't feel right. Something feels off."
Mm,
And part of that is, I'm not trying to give myself reassurance, but just to, like, lay it out is, like, things are different in my life a little bit, and my schedule's different because the holiday, and the moment my brain notices something different, it's like, "Oh, what's that? What is that, girl?
what is it, Lassie?
Get it, girl. Yeah. Where's your ball?" And I'm like, "Should I call Lauren? Am I gonna be okay?" And I'm like, "Oh, fuck this. Like, I'm not doing this right now. Like,
Yeah.
you got to shower. Like, let's go. Come on.
Yeah.
Let's
You
go."
got stuff to do.
And that's hard sometimes for people if they haven't been through this show before,
Yeah.
is like there's something about exposure and response prevention that feels cold and
Mm,
mechanical, is like, well, that person doesn't care about my feelings. Like, I'm talking, I have compassion and I'm kind to myself, but I'm also like, let's go. Like, we don't want to be
yeah.
in this space trying to figure out whether or not your brain feels normal or
Yeah.
not.
Let's not do that. Shall
Jeez.
we? Let's just skip that part and move on. And I
Yeah.
think that's where humor, as we talk about so often, can play a huge role in recovery, because in that moment, like, we said this earlier in the episode, right? But like, snap out of it, like, and remembering Cher and Moonstruck, right? Like that's going to sort of bring a levity to it.
Yeah.
But there's also a firmness and a directness of like, no, we're not doing that right
Hmm.
now. No.
You know what you got to do. And it's just not this.
No, it's not this. You just got to
So,
live your best off life.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because pretty soon your hand's not going to look real, and that's going to really be weird. You're not going to know who's breathing. Who's in your lung? Are you breathing?
Is it you
What's
or
free
is
will?
it?
Does free will exist?
Oh no.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And then just no thank you, and then move on.
Yeah.
We're not doing that. And I know we're giggling, but and I do want to acknowledge, like, this is really scary stuff. It really
Oh my
is.
God.
It's the scariest, all of it, and the bringing in that laughter is really to help sort of like snap us out of it, right, and
Right.
get us back into living life on our terms.
Yeah. It's so true.
Yeah. Well, any
Yeah.
other final parting thoughts?
No.
Well,
Just go out and live your best Truman Show life ever.
yeah. Put on a great show,
Put on
really.
a good show. Let's see what you got.
And we'll be back next time with a new theme. And our schedule is a little bit different in the coming weeks, actually. We've got next Monday, December 4th, we'll be meeting and recording. And again, on the 18th, we're doing every other week at the moment, but with the holidays, we're going to be taking off the 25th and the 1st and coming back on January the 8th of 2024. How weird is that?
So weird.
And with on that note, speaking of a sense of unreality, that's not a real date. We hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, take good care.
Yeah. As always, it's good to talk about things with you.
Always good to talk about things with you too. TTFN.
Yeah.
Ta-ta for now.